Just over 2 years ago now, I got a call from an old friend's wife. I thought it'd be her and my old friend Luke passing on some belated Christmas wishes, as I hadn't seen either of them over the festive period. It marked the first time in almost 20 years that I hadn't seen him during that time, but for that, there was a very reasonable explanation. The week before Christmas, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away. He and his family were devastated, so instead of doing the usual and spending every spare moment down at the pub, he very understandably wanted to have a quiet Christmas. The funeral had been small, a family affair, and so when the name of Luke's wife popped up on my phone, I was excited to hear from her and my old friend. But as it turned out, Luke wasn't there, and in fact, he'd gone missing. Sarah said it wasn't so much Luke's absence that worried her. It was what he'd said before he left. He was still grieving, so the idea of him needing some time alone was understandable, but when Sarah said he mentioned something about talking to an angel, my jaw dropped. Sarah asked where he was going and why, and Luke only told her, "You wouldn't understand," or "You wouldn't believe me." Sarah then said she wouldn't let him leave until he told her where he was going, and when Luke replied, "To talk to an angel," she was too stunned to stop him as he shoved his way past her with a bag full of supplies and some spare clothes. When she asked if I knew what that meant, I said yes, that I did, and that while I couldn't promise anything, I had a pretty good idea where I could find him, and not only would I tell her where that was, I'd do one better. I'd drive all the way up to Scotland, and I'd bring Luke home myself. Sarah was worried Luke had gone insane, and while I didn't know if that was the case, I knew that if we got the police involved, Luke might end up getting into some serious trouble. Now, we didn't want him locked in a cell or doing 30 days in a mental health unit if all he needed was just a nice hug. And if he needed serious treatment, then sure, we could go down that road if we needed to. But both me and Sarah agreed that the best thing to do was to find him before he got himself into trouble. And not just the legal kind either. More like trouble from the weather. Sarah noticed how Luke was packing some camping gear into his car before he left, another thing which frightened her because where was he planning on camping in the middle of bloody winter? She had no idea, but I did. Like I said, Scotland. More than 20 years before, when myself, Luke, and two friends of ours were all either 21 and 22, we went on a camping trip to Ayrshire. We drove out to a place called Loch Braden, set up a campsite near the loch's edge, and then spent a few days roasting chestnuts on an open fire, getting piss drunk and hoping it would snow. And yes, you heard that right. We didn't head out camping in the summertime like normal people. We went 2 days after Christmas because we felt cheated out of a white one and fancied an excuse to booze it up around a warm, crackling fire. Now, I know that probably sounds mental to some people who would rightly assume winter camping to be a pretty terrible idea, but we were young, dumb, and full of such terrible ideas. And so off we went. It didn't snow while we were there, but we did find a chestnut tree, and now the taste forever reminds me of freezing my balls off up in Scotland. It was worth it for the fire and booze and the banter, though, and it wasn't just beer and vodka keeping our own fires burning, if you know what I mean. We were passing spliffs back and forth, but not Luke. Luke didn't do anything like that, so nothing but alcohol passed his lips. Or at least, it seemed that way, right up until the point he just sort of walked off. Now, me and our two friends were absolutely bombed, so while we were splitting our sides over absolute nonsense, Luke seemed to be on a different wavelength. I kept an eye on him to make sure that he was doing okay, and he didn't seem sad. But over time, he got quieter and quieter until eventually he just got up and walked off on his own. We called out to him, asking where he was going, because we'd usually announce if we were going for a piss or whatever, for safety purposes, I suppose. But Luke didn't say anything, and we had to call out and ask where he was going just to be told, "Just going for a walk." Now, me and our two pals started poking fun at him and saying he was slinking off to take the knock, as we called it, which just means vomiting after drinking or smoking too much. Now, I thought that he'd be back in a few minutes, but I think maybe an hour flew by with us just laughing away before we realized that Luke still hadn't come back. Now, we started panicking a bit, because our mobiles were useless out there in the middle of nowhere, so off we went with our torches to go looking for Luke. Now, it got quite scary at times, and not just because we were so drunk and stoned, but because reality started to become something of an elastic concept at times. That was mostly my fault, and that admission will make a lot more sense later. But for now, let me quickly reassure you by saying that we found Luke, safe and sound, and got him back to the campsite. Now, we were all knackered by then, so not long after getting back to camp, we got into our sleeping bags and let the campfire burn down as we got some much-needed rest. But then, as we're all lying there in our tents and there's nothing but quiet and stillness, Luke spoke up in this obviously drunken voice and said something like, "Guys, I saw an angel out there." Now, he said it so sincerely that we all just sort of burst out laughing. One of our friends, Ben, replied asking, "Bloody hell, mate, how much you had to drink?" Now, our other friend was laughing, saying, "You saw a Christmas angel, did you? My arse, you did. The angel flew out of those lagers you were drinking." Now, Luke insisted he wasn't mistaken, but sounded like he was on the verge of passing out, and then once the laughter died down, we all just sort of slowly fell asleep. Now, the next day, we packed away the camping gear and agreed on a nice fried breakfast in a cafe before heading home. We poked a bit of fun at Luke over his claim that he'd seen an angel, but he took it on the chin with a very much, "Fine, you don't have to believe me" kind of attitude. Now, I assumed Luke might feel a bit embarrassed and was all too willing to move on from his little sighting, but he didn't. In fact, over the next year or so, the angel sighting seemed to be the basis for Luke's newfound faith. He didn't turn into a complete Bible thumper or anything like that, and since he didn't shove it down our throats or anything, me and his other friends were just kind of like, "Whatever floats your boat, pal." Some came to believe that whenever Luke talked about the angel, he was weaving a kind of metaphor about finding God up in Scotland one Christmas after having a bit too much to drink. But I knew Luke wasn't talking in metaphors. He really did think that he'd seen an angel. And so when he told his wife that he was going to talk to one, I had a pretty good idea of where he was heading. And that place was Loch Braden, the same place that we'd gone camping all those years before. I rang into work, told them I needed a few days off of work for personal reasons, and then drove up to Ayrshire first thing in the morning. I then reached Loch Braden by about 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was snow at the time, not much of it, but enough to give it that proper desolate look. And I can't say it was enjoyable though, because strong winds meant that it was absolutely freezing, and I had to bundle up against the cold before heading out in search of Luke. I didn't wander around the loch, calling out his name. Instead, I was laser guided towards the place we'd camped at all those years earlier, and when I found it, there stood a dark green tent with a dead campfire and a few bits of camping equipment sitting near the entrance. I called out to Luke asking, "Are you there, mate?" But the tent was empty. I had no way of knowing if the tent was really his, not until I found the Bible he had sitting next to a rolled-up sleeping bag, and then I knew. I then spent the next hour or so wandering around the snowy woods calling out Luke's name, but when I didn't find him, I wandered back to his camp and decided to wait for him there while I got a fire going to keep warm. It was almost dark by the time I heard footsteps approaching, and at first I was a bit nervous that it wouldn't be Luke. But it was, and since I already had a feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, I wasn't surprised when he wasn't. No, I said something to him like, "Hey mate," and was about to offer an explanation as to why I was there, but Luke cut me off by asking who told me where he was. Now, I didn't want to get his back up by treating him like a kid. I wanted cooperation, so that's what I went with, and told him Sarah was worried about him. He didn't get angry or anything, not yet, because he knew we were just concerned about him, but Luke did let me know, and very firmly, that he wouldn't be leaving till he talked to his angel. I honestly couldn't tell if he had gone crackers or not, so I tried to test him, in my own little way, on little bits of info. I asked him how long he'd been there, what route he'd taken on the drive up, and what he'd said to Sarah before leaving. All his answers seemed kind of lucid, and he didn't mention any kind of wild conspiracy theories or anything delusional like that, and he didn't go off on any religious rants either. He said he didn't expect me, his wife, or anyone else to understand, but he needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mom. And when he said that last part, it felt almost like a punch to the gut. Or maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but it was just such a sad but almost sort of relatable thing to want. Like I said earlier, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away, and he was understandably taking that very badly. But it wasn't a question of what he was doing being healthy or not, or if what was happening was something much more damaging. It was a question of what Luke was going to do when I told him the truth. We had a nice long chat about the camp trip that we went on, and then touched on how his mom's funeral had been. It was nice to reminisce, but seeing him grieving so deeply was very tough. But then as we continued talking over a campfire supper and the darkness fully crept in, we got talking about Luke's angel and what it may or may not have been. Again, he was weirdly reasonable about it and didn't expect anyone to understand. It was just something that he had to do so he could be at peace with his mom's passing. But then, I asked how he'd feel if I could guarantee he wouldn't find his angel again, because it was my fault he thought he'd seen one in the first place. Luke just sort of laughed, because the very idea that it was me that was responsible for him seeing his angel was laughable. But the only reason he didn't full-on belly laugh, at least in my opinion, was the look on my face when suggesting it. Because I wasn't joking. In fact, I was very serious. Because the reason Luke wandered off in a daze like he did, and the reason he believed that he saw an angel, was because I put a tiny bit of LSD in his alcohol when he went off for a piss. He was already drunk and he was drinking some cheap piss, so he didn't pick up on the taste at first, and I thought it'd have a funnier effect on him, but I guess it didn't. And when he didn't come back when he thought he would, I felt very personally responsible. No one but me knew I brought any, and I was planning on telling him that what I'd done come bedtime or the next morning. But after we, or should I say I, almost lost Luke, I decided not to tell anyone what I'd done for fear of the backlash. And then as the years went by, I felt more and more guilty about what I'd done. So much so that when Luke's wife told me that he'd put himself in danger by camping up in Scotland in the middle of winter, I felt personally responsible. It might have only been a snort, but Luke laughed when I suggested I was responsible for his angel sighting. But when I mentioned the acid that I'd slipped into his beer, not even a trace of amusement was visible in his face. He went full-on denial mode and argued that I was only saying that to get him to come home. Now, I suppose I should make it clear to anyone reading this that I wasn't just making it up, and I really did put drugs in my friend's drink. My defense at the time was that it wasn't much. Enough to get him loosey-goosey, but not full-on tripping. But that's no excuse, I know that, because that one stupid joke had altered Luke's whole reality. And although he completely refused to accept it at first, that didn't last long. I think the thing that really pushed him over the edge was when I started describing his symptoms back to him. I told him that although he was quiet, I was worried about him because I knew the dose that I'd given him would serve as a real mood enhancer. And I also knew that he'd walked away from the fire at first because it was too bright for him. First-time trips can be like that, especially if you don't know what's going on. And I added it was me who initiated the Luke's going to vomit joke, partly to try and distract from the fact that I'd dosed him. I told him whatever he'd seen out there, be it a trick of the light or a big bird of prey passing over the face of the moon, his imagination had taken hold of it and turned it into something it wasn't. I was halfway into explaining how I knew it couldn't have been some full-on hallucination because I'd given him such a low dosage when Luke just charged me. He didn't shout or scream, he just started attacking me in a complete frenzy, punching and kicking till I was on the ground and curled up in a ball shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I did try and defend myself at first, purely on instinct, I suppose. But as you can imagine, it was a complete mismatch in terms of how angry he was versus how sorry I was. And when he stopped kicking me, Luke dropped to his knees and kind of rolled me over. I thought he was going to start punching me in the face, but instead, his hands went for my throat, and he started to strangle me. I reached up to try and claw his fingers away from my neck, and then I tried grabbing his arms at the elbows to drag them away, but neither thing worked. And it was then that I had this horrible moment of realization that this was how I was going to die. Murdered up in Scotland by one of my oldest friends because I'd revealed his entire belief system was the result of nothing more than a prank. I don't think I deserved to die for something like that, but in the moment, I had a very dark sense of, I get it. I brought this on myself. I still tried to get his hands off of me, but all that rage in him, it was like it gave him super strength or something. And I think it was only the thoughts of the consequences that made him stop. And by that I mean if he thought he could have gotten away with killing me, I'm not sure Luke would have let go. But he did. And when he did, it was like taking my very first breath of life all over again. I've never known a lungful like that, but I could feel how puffy and hot my face was from how red it had turned. And all the I'm sorries got replaced with thank yous, because it was clear he'd just spared my life. But Luke wasn't ready to let bygones be bygones, and after pacing back and forth for a minute straight, still in a rage, he told me to do one, meaning get lost. I remember wanting to ask him if he was sure we couldn't just talk it out, but I knew that'd be a waste of breath. I'd never seen him that angry before, and not that I deserved it, but I knew that there'd be no reasoning with him at this point. Luke saw me hesitating to leave and then came at me shouting to F off and making out like he was going to hit me, and so I did as he asked and left. I walked back to my car, feeling the aches from Luke's punches and kicks and the soreness in my throat, and then drove back home, and we never spoke since. I called his wife from a service station and filled her in on everything that had happened. I put off telling her about the spiking incident for as long as I could, but when I did, she did a kind of verbal double take in asking me to repeat myself, and when I did, she immediately hung up. There was no anger, no insults. She just hung up the phone, and that was the last time I spoke to her, too. I understand why they've chosen to cut me off. I just hope that one day they find it in their hearts to forgive me, and if Luke still has his faith after I told him, then I hope that'll one day be the case. Because after thinking about it for quite a while, and I think that in a way, Luke really did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite, and when it spoke to him and told him to spare my life, he listened. My name's Allison. I'm from Seattle, and while it took me way longer than I wanted to, I'm finally ready to send this over. For the longest time, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris suffered from persistent depressive disorder. It started after he lost his job, got violently mugged, and then got really sick with some kind of viral infection, all while his relationship with his fiancée was falling apart around him. He ended up moving back in with his parents up near Richmond Beach for a while, and then after finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and leave the house every day, Chris just sort of stopped trying. He was put on various cocktails of medication in the hopes one might work, but nothing did, and for a while he just rotted away indoors. But then in early spring of 2019, Chris asked if I wanted to go get sushi. He was online a lot, which was pretty much the only way we kept in touch, so hearing from him wasn't a shock. But hearing that he wanted to meet in person, that came as a real surprise. I accepted the invitation, and while he still had a whiff of hermit about him, he seemed way, way better than before. I didn't question it. I was just too happy to see progress. But at the same time, I knew that there had to be something going on in Chris's life to prompt such an improvement in him. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to figure out what it was. The day after we met for sushi, I asked Chris what had changed, like if he'd been doing or taking something new. And he said he'd found a kind of support group that met once a week, and since he started going, he'd been feeling a lot better about life. They met in a coffee shop, but they didn't sit in a circle, doing land acknowledgments and using therapy language. It was more like show up, hang out, and just talk to people for real. And that was usually a little talk at the end by the group's organizer, but that consisted of nothing more than a poem and maybe the odd announcement. It was very informal, very laid back, and for the first time in a long time, Chris found the confidence to start living his life again. Now, this was obviously great to hear, so I asked about it, and Chris said the group was called Mother's Love. It seems so crazy to me that after all the medication and all the therapy that Chris really just needed some connection, you know? I don't take it to heart that we as friends couldn't do that for him either, because Chris needed new connections with new people as concrete evidence that he could place faith in his fellow humans again. Sometimes I'd ask him about the group, and that's how I found out that they didn't have any kind of online presence, because they didn't want a whole bunch of people turning up and killing the vibe. It was supposed to be intimate and meaningful, so it was down to attendees to exercise discretion in who they invited. I had to wait months until late December of that same year, 2019, to get anything resembling an invite. But when that invite came, it was not in the form I expected it to be. When Chris asked if I was still interested in getting involved, I told him I didn't know about involved, but I sure did want to stop by so I could check it out. And that's when he told me about the winter retreat. According to him, Mother's Love had reached a point where expansion was starting to make sense, so each current member had been instructed to pick out a +1 for a weekend of camping. And then to incentivize their attendance, the whole weekend of the retreat would be entirely free for that +1. And at first I wasn't sure, because spending 2 nights in a tent together in the freezing cold did not sound like my idea of fun. But when Chris told me it'd be more like glamping, as in like super warm tents with super fancy features, I totally had to reconsider. He said the food would be all vegan, which was awesome, and that the open bar on Saturday night would be a really fun way of making new friends while getting lit for free. Well, that about sealed it for me, and I promptly prepared myself for a weekend of winter camping. We arrived at what amounted to a luxury campground on Friday afternoon, and it was totally amazing. They had showers, a bar that served hot food, and then a kind of conference and party room. And the tents? They were more like miniature cabins. They had covered floors, a heater, separate sleeping compartments, thank God to be honest, and a little communal space with squishy log pillows to sit on. We didn't just have super cozy, faux fur-lined sleeping bags either. We were giving these heavy, memory foam sleeping mattresses as well, and they were super squishy and soft. It was definitely not what sprang to mind when I thought free camping weekend, but I also remember wondering, who the hell put all the money up for this? And I definitely wasn't about to question it though, so I just sort of went with it. Now, once we were all settled in, one of the retreat's organizers stopped by mine and Chris's tent and asked us to attend a little conference hall for the welcoming ceremony. We found about 30 people in the conference hall before Chris started introducing me to some of the people he knew. We chatted for a while, making introductions, and finally, an older lady took to the podium and asked for our attention. She introduced herself as Mary, and then after welcoming all the newcomers to Mother's Love, she touched on some topics that we'd be discussing over the next 48 hours or so. And only then did I realize that Chris hadn't told me the whole story. I don't want to rehash everything that Mary lady said, because she talked for 45 minutes, but most of it was about the seminars, and this is the gist of it. There was one about maintaining a low impact on the environment, which was all well and good, but then there was one about anti-natalism, which turned out to be a fancy word for thinking having babies is wrong or something. And when I asked Chris about that afterwards, he said some people believe the earth is so overpopulated that it's messing up the environment. But I thought Chris's group was just coffee and pancakes, not hardcore political stuff. And Chris said it didn't start out that way. It was just something that they all got talking about over time. But there seemed to be a dramatic difference between the seminar on centering oneself in nature and the one I think was titled The Death March of Western Capitalism. Now, I thought we were going to be drinking cocoa around a campfire and going on nature walks, but Chris just kind of shrugged it off. He said he wasn't really into the political stuff either, so we could just sit it out if I wanted to and head off on that nature walk when I was excited to. And then I asked him about something Mary had said when she was introducing herself, and his response wasn't nearly so reassuring. And so when Mary, the organizer lady, introduced herself, she said a number in the 300s, and then ppm, and I'm thinking, huh? What? In my head, but she just breezed right past it without explaining. Chris said that Mary and a lot of the regulars didn't use numbers to describe their birth years. They used ppm, which, after double-checking it, definitely stands for parts per million, and then the number describes how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during that year. And so like when Mary said I was born in 300 whatever ppm, she meant like the 50s or something. And I remember thinking, bro, what the heck, this is goofy as hell. Because, yeah, screw the oil companies, dude, sure, but using ppm instead of just saying your birth year, just a bunch of weirdos. But Chris didn't think it was all that funny. I mean, he smiled, but he didn't seem to think it was dumb like I did. And then I asked him if he knew what ppm he was born at. Then, without skipping a beat, he then says 352. He laughed at my reaction and said he didn't go around telling people like Mary and the others. It was just something he Googled one time out of interest and then happened to remember. And I remember feeling like I'd kind of let him down because I was definitely not going to be able to sit through a whole bunch of political seminars. But he said not to worry, that we'd just go to the ones that sounded interesting to me. And then we went over to dinner and got talking about some of the other campers. And that part was actually super fun. Like, I'm a really social butterfly, so getting to meet everyone was cool. Dinner was great too, and we had vegan Indian food and a few drinks, and then after more of that political talk from Mary, we all went back to our tents to enjoy our early night before an early start. Now, I won't bore you with everything we did that next day because it was a lot, but it was actually super chill until dinner that evening when we started to get hyped about the party with all the free booze. But before we went off to our tents again to get ready, Mary had an announcement to make. She said the next morning all the retreat's male attendees would be entitled to receive a gift, a blessing of Mother Nature in fact, and it was entirely free. Unfortunately, the same gift would not be bestowed on female attendees, but that was something that they were looking into, and anyone interested should approach an organizer with their queries. There was a lot of confused female faces, but also notice how not all the girls there looked confused. Some of them looked like they knew exactly why, and that should have been my first big clue right there. Well, heading back to the glamping tent to get ready for the party, I asked Chris what this free gift was all about. Chris said that he had to talk to me about something, but I asked if it could wait because by that point my curiosity was burning. But then Chris said it was that very same free gift he wanted to talk to me about, and so I'm thinking, okay, go on, and when he told me, I remember my jaw dropping, because Chris told me that free gift was a vasectomy. Now, I thought he was joking, and while Chris was smiling, it wasn't in a jokey way, more like in a this is good news kind of way. As it turns out, I had no idea this was the case till Chris went through it with me, but a vasectomy is actually a super simple procedure. Guys only need a local anesthetic, and then a trained professional can render a dude infertile with just a single needle-thin puncture to a guy's taint. It's not a major surgery, and while a guy definitely needs to rest up and avoid serious exercise or exertion, it's not like he's going to be held up in a hospital bed for a week like a woman after her hysterectomy. And so after I told Chris, no way, dude, they can't do surgeries out here, that's impossible, he made it clear that not only was it very possible, but he was planning on getting the snip, as he called it, that very next morning. And I'm like, this is a joke, right? But Chris wasn't kidding. He said what brought him so much hope was the idea no one else would have to suffer like he did. His parents had brought him into the world against his will, without ever considering whether he might be happy or not. And that was a mistake he wasn't going to repeat. Knowing he wouldn't be able to reproduce made him feel like he was doing something to solve the problem, even if it was just one small but significant act. Now, I'm sure a lot of heartless psychos are going to read this and say, Chris was making a choice about his body, how dare you try and prevent that? Well, first off, go jump in a dumpster. And while you're in there, lying among the trash where you belong, consider that I wasn't objecting to him getting a piercing or getting frosted tips or whatever. I was objecting to him getting a mother-freaking vasectomy. Oh, but what's that I hear you cry? Oh, people from the trash, you can reverse a vasectomy. That is indeed true, but then riddle me this, dumpster dude. Does the reversal involve actual knock-you-out surgery and reopening the old vasectomy scar? Well, yes, it does. And is the surgery always successful? No, it's not. And while I didn't know that till I Googled it in a panic, I sure as heck showed it to Chris when I did. And if he didn't want to have kids, he could put a damned hood on it, or the 100 other not safe for work things people do to make sure their humps don't mean bumps, as they say. But no, Chris had made his mind up. He wanted his little sacred rights so he could respect his mother's love, and there was nothing I could do to convince him otherwise. But on that, he was wrong. Rather than go into the whole drama of what happened when we were drunk, I'll just cut to the important part. We got plastered on all that free alcohol, and while I tried my very best to drop the whole vasectomy objection and just enjoy our time together, that obviously proved impossible. I got fixated on the idea the root of his motivation was destructive, not constructive, and that maybe he wasn't as mentally well as he thought he was. When we went somewhere quiet to talk, I told him how he had zero clue what was going to happen in the future, and how he might well live to regret his decision, especially if reversing the process failed and he was made infertile for good. Now he's drunk and says, "What's the point? What woman would ever want to have kids with me?" And so I told him lots of women would, maybe even myself, because, like I said, you never know how the future's going to unfold. Now, we didn't immediately start making out like in the movie or anything, but I thought I actually got through to him after saying how once he was done putting himself together and had a job and took care of himself, then he was attracted enough that plenty of girls would want to date him. And after that, we hugged it out, and he thanked me for not just being his plus one, but being a good friend and giving him hope. Now, I'll admit, that made me tear up and cry a little, but I was also super smashed, so there was that. We went back to the party, had a couple of more drinks to lift our spirits again, and then we went back to our tent and went to sleep, in our own separate sleeping compartments. Now, my memory of those last couple of hours is kind of hazy, I'll be honest, but what I do remember is going to sleep with the knowledge that one of my best friends was not about to do something potentially irreversible. But when I woke up the next morning, Chris wasn't in the tent. I put on a bunch of warm clothes and went looking for him, but was so hungover that I only got a few steps out of our glamping tent before I ran into a tree and started puking while leaning against it. Now after that, and once I sort of cleaned myself up, I went looking for Chris, but found the atmosphere in the camp to be way different than before. During the previous 2 days, whenever we went anywhere, everyone was saying, "Hey, how's it going?" to us, and were generally super friendly. But when I walked around the camp that morning, everyone just sort of stared at me in total silence. I mean, they whispered and talked among themselves as I passed, but they wouldn't say anything to me, and they wouldn't return my fake, panicking but pretending to be friendly smiles. Now, I kept asking, "Has anyone seen Chris?" But no one would answer me, and it took until I found one of the organizers before I got any kind of explanation. The conference room was being used as the surgery, and I could already see a couple of guys sitting in the little waiting area through a large window, but I couldn't see Chris. And that's when I was approached by that same girl who welcomed us on the first day and was asked to return to our tent so we could talk in private. On the way, I kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" But she wouldn't tell me, not until we got back to our tent when she confirmed it. Chris has gotten up that morning bright and early, and not only did he get the snip, but he was literally the first guy to get it done. He was actually resting in another tent as we spoke and was kept separate from me because of what a, quote, negative person I was being. Now, she was the first one who told me what a terrible person I was for not just being like, "Yeah, cool, no big deal, bud." And I said the same thing to her as I'd said to anyone else. "Go F yourself with a cactus, you psychos." Chris was a vulnerable, emotionally damaged person who needed serious psychiatric care, and then as his new friends, instead of encouraging him to get it, they tricked him into a physical solution to what was a mental problem. And personally, I'll never stop hating them for that. I'll also never stop hating them for how they let people treat me as I was leaving. I cannot overstate how sickening it was to attend a seminar on feminism in Trump's America one day, and then the next, have women just standing back and smiling as grown-ass men got up in my face and screamed the C word at me so furiously that I remember their spittle landing on my cheek. I actually thought that they were going to beat me up by the time they started shoving me and throwing rocks. They didn't give a crap that I was Chris's ride either. They said that they'd find a real friend to drive him home, and I should get the hell out of there while I still could. I was shaking by the time I got to my car with my stuff, and I was in tears by the time I had the keys in the ignition. I felt like I'd enabled one of my oldest friends to do something awful to himself, and then by the time I realized what was even happening, it was too late and I'd done too little to stop it. Chris and I haven't spoken since. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't want to now. I don't even care if he got a vasectomy anymore. I mean, it's his body, his choice, right? But I just wish he'd stop punishing me for trying to play the devil's advocate and convince him that a permanent solution to a temporary problem might not have been the way to go, and that weird cult that he joined is very, very weird. So Chris, if you're out there, call me. I miss you. My name is Alf. I'm a fan from Sweden, and today I would like to tell you my very own true scary story about the most frightening experience of my whole life. I joined the Army when I was 18, and I loved being a soldier. But when I was 23, I was diagnosed with a rare medical disorder and had to be discharged. I was devastated, and while I eventually adjusted to a new routine, I still miss being in the field very much. I ended up asking a couple of my old school friends if they'd like to go camping sometime, and while most thought that was a great idea, they didn't so much enjoy the specifics of my idea. For obvious reasons, most camping here takes place in the summertime, but I didn't want to go in the summertime. I wanted to go in the freezing Swedish winter. Most people thought that I was crazy, and were saying, "No thanks, friend, I'm out." Others said that they'd consider it and then dropped out one by one as the days ticked down to D-Day. In the end, the only person left who was dead set on joining me was an old friend of ours who'd moved to a different city, a friend named Varg. Varg wasn't really named Varg, it was his nickname he gave himself, meaning wolf, which should give you an instant idea of what he was like as a person. And well, despite it, I can safely tell you that he was even worse than you might imagine. If we hadn't been such close friends for so long, there's no way that I'd have tolerated behavior like Varg's. And honestly, I think him moving to Bergen for a girl that he met online actually saved our friendship, and he wasn't around to act like a jackwad anymore. He would drink and drive, get into big fights with his girlfriend, and post all about it on Facebook, and he was constantly getting fired from menial jobs for doing the stupidest things, like drinking openly on the job or sleeping on shift and then getting angry when his colleagues woke him up. And like I said, I definitely wouldn't have been friends with him had I met him yesterday, but for the most part, we actually got along quite well. We had a similar sense of humor, we both enjoyed the same sort of movies and music, and we both had a big passion for outdoor survival scenarios, and that's how I ended up thinking that just me and Varg, a winter camping trip, might actually be a good time. But one of the real pros of camping in the winter was the lack of bears, which usually hibernate between late autumn and the very late spring. Now, I still insisted that we hang some bear bait somewhere away from the camp, but it didn't help, and even though we went camping in late February, we were unfortunate enough to be found by a bear who'd woken up too early and was desperate to find food. We woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a huge brown bear sniffing around our camp, having eaten the bait and went looking for more. We rushed out of the tent, yelling and screaming at it in the darkness to scare it away. It appeared to work at first, and the bear backed off, but then it sort of false-charged and tricked me into stumbling backwards so awkwardly I actually sprained my ankle pretty badly. Thankfully, it was just a false charge, otherwise I'd have been in very serious trouble. But even though we managed to scare it off for good using the bear mace that we carried with us, we were almost out of food, and my ankle was in a very sorry state. I took some painkillers, and then we tried to fix up our campsite a little and salvage our food before heading back to our tent. We slept until dawn, not very well I should add, and then once it was light, Varg volunteered to find a shop somewhere so he could bring back food and some stronger painkillers. I thought that was very cool of him, like just the sort of behavior that kept me friends with him, and Varg can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but you could really rely on him when you really needed to. I stayed in the tent with my ankle raised and the bear mace at the ready, and then, maybe 2.5 hours later, Varg reappeared with his pack full of stuff. Now, I thought that he'd have more than some bread, bacon, and my painkillers, but when he emptied the bag inside our tent, he had all kinds of stuff with him. He had a few bottles of vodka, a whole carton of cigarettes, dozens of bars of chocolate, and a lot of elk jerky, or what we call renja snacks. Varg also had a ton of medication with him too, but not just painkillers. There were all kinds of things, from anti-allergy medicine to antacids for stomach trouble, and while I expected Varg to be pleased with himself at having brought back such a bounty, he seemed almost angry. He emptied out the bag with some force, like he was full of spite, and when I saw that strange variety of medicine tumble out onto the ground, I started to get kind of suspicious. I asked Varg where he'd gotten all that stuff, and he just said, "I found a shop." But then when I asked him why he bought me anti-allergy medication, he snapped a little and said he just grabbed whatever he could because he needed to be fast. It made sense in a way. Varg wasn't a rich man, and he wasn't generous or careless with his money, and so after a moment of thought, I turned to him and asked, "Did you steal these things?" No, I knew the answer before he even said anything. He had that guilty look about him that I knew all too well, and in the past I sometimes found it funny, because you could always read his face when he'd be the one to do something wrong, like hide the teacher's chalk or put a pin on another people's chair. But that time, I didn't find it funny, and neither did Varg. He still had that angry air about him as he told me, "I didn't have enough money." And I found this outrageous, as any normal person would only buy what they could afford. But at any objection, Varg tried to defend himself by explaining what had happened. He said at first, all he did was put down the painkillers, the vodka, and the cigarettes, but he was short by just a couple of krona, our dollars here. And the lady tells him he needs more money, but Varg insisted it was an emergency and she needed to accept the amount he had. Obviously, the lady saw no emergency, just a man trying to buy vodka at like 8 in the morning, and so she told him no. Varg said he offered to come back later with the rest of the money, but sensing he probably wouldn't, the woman said no once again. And this is when Varg lost his mind. He attacked the lady, beat her till she wasn't moving anymore, and then filled his pack with anything he could grab before running out of the shop. He didn't even get help from me, he just ran before someone came along to see what he'd done. I was furious, but so was he, and if you can believe it, we argued back and forth about who was in the right. Varg insisted he did the right thing for me and him, and that was all that mattered, and to this day I still can't believe he saw things that way. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate his instinct to take care of an injured friend, but what he did to that woman was unforgivable, and we argued about it for quite a while until finally he announced that he was getting drunk. Varg couldn't go back to the little country shop that he'd found, the only one for miles around. He'd have to walk for miles and miles to some other place to get help, and the cold had completely killed our little flip phones, so we needed a landline, and then since we were way out in the middle of nowhere, Varg would have to search long and hard to find one he could use. So before that, he was going to get drunk. Now, if you imagine Varg planned on getting drunk and then getting back behind the wheel of my car, then yes, that's exactly what he's planning on doing, and this sparked another argument between us. But since it truly was a case of beggars not being able to be choosers, I had to shut my mouth, drink a little vodka to help the painkillers along, and wait until he was good and ready to help me. And there came a point when there was nothing but silence. I didn't have anything to say to him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. And then as we sat there, me eating and him smoking, I noticed a little plane flying in the sky above our heads. I didn't think much of it at first. Who would? It was just a small plane, but then minutes later, I saw it fly over us again before it started circling us. Now, for the sake of nothing but my own amusement, I started waving at it with both arms as if to say, "SOS, help us." I hoped it might fly straight and dip its wings or something, like a sign that it had seen us, but not a minute later, it flew away again without any kind of signal or indication. Varg kept on drinking and smoking for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then finally stood up on very wobbly legs and said, "Okay, time to go." I remember groaning, not in pain, but at the thought of him being pulled over, or worse, driving my car off the road and getting himself hurt. But as I looked up at him, I saw someone behind him walking towards us through the snowy trees, and he had what looked like a shotgun in his hands. Varg must have seen my expression because he turned around to check out what I was seeing, and then when he did, He yelled, "Run," and then started sprinting away as fast as he could. I saw the man stop and aim at us, so I tried my best to also run as I heard a single shot boom around the landscape. As per my army training, I instinctively threw myself to the ground, and then I remembered letting out a scream of pain as I felt it shoot through my ankle. I got up and tried to run again, but fell down again. I then tried crawling, but knew that I wasn't moving fast enough, and so I did the only thing I could think of and rolled onto my back to face the man approaching us and begged for my life. I knew who it was, or at least I knew why he was shooting at us. It had to be the husband or brother or son of the woman Varg had hurt, and I was right. It was her husband. He had the shotgun pointed right at me as I explained it wasn't me, that it was my friend and that I had nothing to do with it. I think the man knew this and recognized the fleeing Varg from the description he'd been given because he loaded his shotgun and fired a second time. He missed Varg completely, but I didn't know this at the time. And so in my mind, and because there was no screaming, Varg was stone dead, and I was next. I begged him over and over not to shoot me as he loaded a third shell into his shotgun, and then for just a moment, he pointed the barrel right at my face. I thought it was all over for me. I thought I was a dead man. But after I started to pray, something I hadn't done since I was a child, the man lowered the gun and then offered me a hand to help me to my feet. All I could say was, thank you, again and again. It was no platitude either, but rather it stemmed from the deepest sense of gratitude I've ever felt. The man then told me his name was Oscar, and that if I wanted to leave those woods alive, I was going to help the police find the man who had beaten his wife half to death. I told him that sounded like a good deal, and then he helped me back to his 4x4, and we drove over to his store to meet his wife, who was being treated by paramedics, and more importantly, the policeman waiting for me. I was only too happy to talk to them, partly to clear my name and partly to fulfill my promise to Oscar. I wanted to do the right thing, but I also firmly believed that if I didn't, he would find me and kill me. Varg ended up going to prison for 6 years for what he did, but I heard they let him out in 4. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I consider it good riddance. But there is a part of me that wonders if someday he may pay me a visit to ask why I was so willing to talk to the police about him. And without pointing too fine a point on it, if he does, he won't get to escape like he did from that woman's husband. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always jack your wad.